So I'm here in the Busan United Nations War Grave Cemetery, where just over 260 Australians lie buried from the Korean War, and a small batch of them can be seen just here. The cemetery staff were kind enough to give me a flower upon request. I haven't decided where to lay it yet, whether I'll put it at this grave site, at the main Australian grave site, or at the Australian Memorial. It is a beautifully kept cemetery, but anyway, I thought I'd make this video just talking a little bit about the Korean War and Australia's involvement and the impact that Australia had on it and what it meant to us. So the Korean War was a result of basically poor decision making following World War II. Korea had been a colony of Japan since 1910, and Japan had milked Korea for every ounce that it had to give. Its people and its land suffered to no end at the hands of the Japanese in that 30-year occupation, or 35-year occupation. When World War II came to an end, the country, like Germany, was partitioned between the East and the West in powers. So you had the Soviet Union, Russia taking control of the North, and the South being controlled by the Western countries, or the democratic countries. By the time all was said and done, you had a communist North and a democratic South. In 1950, the North attempted to reunify the country by invading the South, and they very nearly succeeded. And they would have succeeded if it was not for the newly formed United Nations passing a resolution to intervene on behalf of South Korea. The invasion was illegal, the invasion was unjustified, and to the United Nations, this was their way of preventing yet another world war. Australia was the third country to send troops to serve in Korea. I may be wrong with the dates, but I believe it was October 1950. The relatively new 3 RAR was redeployed from its bases in Japan into Korea, into South Korea, into Busan. By this point, the Americans and the South Koreans had started to manage to turn the tides, and 3 RAR, along with now arriving 77 Squadron of the RAAF, were put into service. 3 RAR serving with 27th Commonwealth Brigade alongside the Princess Patricia's Light Infantry and the 1st Middlesex Regiment, with support from the New Zealand Field Battery. I can't remember the exact unit. I do apologise, New Zealand. Anyway, this brigade saw action as it pushed the North Koreans back at the Battle of the Apple Orchard, and a number of other series of engagements beyond that. And they were almost relatively, it was a relatively minor role for the brigade until the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, where the Chinese pushed their counter-offensive on the side of the North, pushing the Allies all the way back. They went down to the south and back up to the 38th parallel. Things stayed there. That's where things relatively ended in 1950. And in 1951 is when it all flares up again. The Chinese launch a massive counter-offensive south, and all hope looks lost for the United Nations forces as the Chinese seem unstoppable with their juggernaut. 27th Commonwealth Brigade form a very hastily assembled defensive line along the valley of Capion. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on Capion because I'll be at the battle site in 2 weeks and I'll make another video then. But all you need to know is the Australians and the Canadians kicked ass and held the Chinese back. So much so that the Americans would refuse to believe that the Australians were still alive when they called in for reinforcements on the 24th of April. Anyway, after Capion, the war sort of bogged down into a bit of a stalemate along 38th parallel, and for the remainder of the conflict it consisted of a few major battles, but largely raids between the two sides. Now, before I go into talk a little bit more, I have arrived at the second grave site for the Australians, and I said not to walk on the grass. I am going to break that rule slightly. And we have the Australian grave sites here. As you can see, there is a lot of them, and I'll be moving down because there's another Australian grave site just beyond here. But so yeah, and in July, I think it was the 27th of July 1953, a ceasefire was put in place. No peace treaty was ever signed, and to this day I don't believe one has. The war technically still goes on and tensions are high, and so that's where we are now. The Korean War, unfortunately, is overlooked. So here we are with I think the last of the Australian, where are we? The last of the Australian graves. As I said, over 260. The Korean War is very much overlooked by the West, so much so it's earned the nickname the Forgotten War. It's this obscure conflict sandwiched between the Second World War and the Vietnam War, both of which are culturally more relevant to Australia. However, when you consider casualties suffered for the time spent in combat, the Korean War is actually the most deadly conflict for Australia since World War II. Vietnam did have more casualties, but it also lasted 3 times as long. So when you condense those numbers down, Korea is far more deadly and far more brutal than Vietnam. But you also can't compare these conflicts to each other in that regards. All I'm saying is it deserves a little bit more remembrance. When you talk to the veterans, a lot of them were quite poorly treated, not in the same way that we think with Vietnam veterans who were spat on and called baby killers, in the fact that no one really saw them for veterans. The Department of Veteran Affairs didn't formally start collecting data on Korean War veterans until the 1990s, at which point they actually realized that they hadn't kept any records on them, which is quite shameful if you think about it. But to the veterans, the war was an incredibly important one. And I know when I was reading Jack Blankley's memoirs, Going Among the Mulberry Trees, an Australian infantryman's story in the Korean War, he says that in his eyes, the Korean War was arguably one of the most justified conflicts in human history. The Korean people had been unbelievably oppressed for about 50 years. Even before the annexation, the Japanese were oppressing them. And in his eyes, it's the only time in the United Nations history that the United Nations did what they were designed to do. And that is use their combined power to prevent injustice in the world. As I said, the North Korean invasion was immoral and it was illegal. And we've all seen what happened to the people of North Korea today. It's an unbelievable dictatorship. And so when the United Nations, put their foot down and said, we're going to step in, we're going to send troops, we're going to stop this invasion, that's exactly what they did, and that's what they were designed to do. Since then, they go on with the peacekeeping operation, which is fantastic, but sometimes you need that firmer hand in place, and that's what Blankley believed. He says that war is this horrible, horrible thing, and it should not exist in our world, but as long as it does exist, there has to be those willing to step up and fight evil. And as I just said, in his eyes, that's what we did in the Korean War. Ultimately, it is a conflict that doesn't have much significance for Australia. It's not like World War II, where Japanese invasion seemed imminent. It's not like Vietnam, where it changed the social structure of our country. It's not like World War I, where it was a proving ground for our ability as a nation. But what it is it's the time that we stepped up on a global stage and we defended someone else's freedom, not because we had to, but because we could. We sent troops to ensure that those around the world could remain free. We weren't selfish. We didn't just look at ourselves. We looked at what we could do for others. And at the end of the day, that's what it should be. If we have the power to make the world a better place, then we should use that power. I get quite annoyed when people say we shouldn't be involved in wars that don't directly affect Australia. Australia is one of the greatest countries in the world. We are one of the most lucky people in the world. And in my opinion, if we have the power to help those around the world less fortunate of us without destroying our own country, then we should do it. And Korea was an exemplary example of that. I've spent the last 5 or so days in Korea, and I've got another week and a half here, maybe a bit more. And I can tell you this, the people of this country, they are living happy and free lives, and they're doing it because our soldiers came here in 1950 and our soldiers fought for that freedom of theirs. All you have to do is look at the north and look at how they're treated and look at what we help to preserve. Anyway, I'm getting a bit preachy now, so I'll stop. But anyway, that's all. Just this Anzac Day, it is the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, so take a moment and just try to remember those servicemen who gave their lives here.